Thank you, choir. That was beautiful. A reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 24. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scholar? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since, in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided, through the foolishness of the proclamation, to save those who believe. For Jews ask for signs, and Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God.
Good morning. Will you please join me in prayer? God, who exists outside of time, I pray that you bless the past, the present, and the future. Bless the preparation of this sermon. Bless its present sharing. Bless the hearts, souls, and minds of the people here to receive it, and this divine dialogue between us. In your name we pray. Amen. So, hi again. If you haven't met me yet, my name is Eva McNabb. My pronouns are they, them, and I will be the seminary intern here at Trinity for the fall and spring semesters. I'm excited to get to know all of you, to learn from the good work that Trinity is doing, and to collaborate with you in the pursuit of divine wisdom, compassion, and liberation. In the vein of that collaboration, I'm honored to be given the opportunity to compare spiritual notes in the form of preaching today. But before I do, I want to take a moment to introduce myself more fully. Preaching can be a vulnerable thing for both the preacher and the listener, particularly if it's your first time actually preaching for a congregation like it is for me today. So thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And so be gentle with me. While preaching can look and seem like a monologue, I have found it helpful to still think of it as a dialogue. Ideally, I won't be sharing thoughts aloud in the vacuum. I'm in conversation with each and every one of you, and each of you is receiving what I have to say within your own context. I know when I'm listening to a sermon, or when I'm actually paying attention to the sermon, I'm doing a lot of processing. I'm mulling over what the preacher is saying, and I'm thinking, does that make sense to me? Do I agree with that? I don't know if I liked that word choice. Here's how I would say it. When having a conversation, it helps to have context. It helps us understand each other and build trust with one another. So, in the pursuit of better understanding each other, I want to give you some background on where I'm coming from. I grew up in a suburb of Maryland, about 20 minutes outside of Washington, D.C., in what I would describe as an ecumenical household. My mother was a pastor in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the same denomination in which Reverend Chelsea is ordained, and my father was Roman Catholic. I had the rare experience of both my parents being devoutly Christian and yet also progressive. My mother was the pastor of a church not unlike Trinity, and my father was a staunch Democrat. My parents were pro-choice and queer-affirming, and as a kid, I was surrounded by families who shared our values. When I entered high school, I was given the opportunity to decide if I wanted to receive the sacrament of confirmation in the Catholic Church. It was framed for me as a moment to decide if I wanted to commit more fully to my Catholic faith, my Disciples of Christ faith, or to another faith entirely. I remember discussing the decision with a mentor, expressing that I loved the spirit of the Catholic Church, but didn't agree with many of its doctrines. The mentor challenged me to consider that if everyone who felt like me left the church, then it would never change. Whether they knew it or not at the time, their response was going to impact the trajectory of my life for the next 8 years. I decided to be confirmed in the Catholic Church with the goal of being a voice for reform within the institution, a lofty goal for anyone, much less a 14-year-old. This goal would follow me into college, where I decided to study Catholic theology at St. Edward's University here in Austin, Texas. Yes! Nice to see a Hilltopper. My intent for most of college was to become a feminist Catholic theologian, advocating for women's ordination and queer inclusion within the church. However, by the time I reached graduation, I found myself needing to take some time to reevaluate this goal. There were several reasons for this reevaluation, some more mundane than others, but the most powerful among them was that in the spring of my senior year of college, my father passed away. As you can imagine, it was one of the greatest griefs and most difficult times of my life. My dad was my first friend, a trusted confidant and mentor, and my anchor in the Catholic faith. As I began to grieve his loss, I realized just how performative my faith had become. I had become attached to ideas of what I thought I should think, rather than what I actually thought. As much as I knew my father wanted me to be Catholic, I also knew that he wanted me to be true to myself and my own beliefs. I quickly realized that only an authentic faith was going to carry me through my grief, and that my convictions were going to need to go through a massive overhaul. As difficult as it was, it fostered some important reflection about what I truly believed and valued. And as a result of that reflection, I ended up taking a step away from the Catholic Church. As much as I loved and still love the spirit of Catholicism, and as much as I hope many of its doctrines do change, I came to terms with how much I was sacrificing my own happiness and well-being in order to participate in the church. Despite the affirming environment I had grown up in, I realized that there were elements of my queer identity that I had been suppressing in order to keep the door to Catholic leadership open. Because I knew I would be expected to marry a man, I never explored my bisexuality. Because I was in communities preoccupied with what it meant to be a good Catholic woman, I never explored how I might be genderqueer. To finally let myself explore these aspects of my identity was a great relief and a great joy. I knew that was an openness I didn't want to give up again, and so I needed to join a religious community that would affirm me living out my identity proudly and publicly. This time of reflection also enabled me to discern my call to congregational ministry. Before then, I sensed that call and often found myself resonating with the call stories of priests and other pastoral leaders. But because I had committed to Catholicism, there was no avenue for people like me to become priests, and I shut down that line of thinking. Once I let that go, however, it became so clear that congregational ministry was something I was passionate about and maybe even good at. In the interim between my undergraduate and graduate studies, I had a sort of last hurrah with the Catholic Church, working as a campus minister at an all-girls Catholic high school. I was responsible for coordinating Mass, planning retreats, and tracking service hours. While that experience affirmed that I needed to take a step away, it also affirmed my call to ministry. I loved working with the students at that school. And as challenging as that job often was, I found joyful fulfillment in providing a safe and brave space for students to explore their spirituality and identity. While in that job, I applied to Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and I was accepted to begin the Master of Divinity program in the fall of 2023. Which brings us here today. Now that you know that context about me, how does it inform the spiritual notes I have to share with you today? Here's what I'll say. I don't believe that everything happens for a reason. I don't believe that my father needed to pass in order for me to come to these realizations about myself. I would much rather that my father was still alive. What I do believe is that God has the power to transform even our most difficult experiences into something generative and life-giving. I'm also coming to terms with the reality that for better or for worse, passing through the wilderness is an essential step on the path to authentic liberation. In last week's lectionary reading from the Old Testament, in Numbers 21, it says that the Hebrew people spoke against God and against Moses, saying, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" The Hebrew people are wondering if it's really better to have escaped Egypt if it means suffering in the wilderness. They are even tempted to return to their previous enslavement because at least then they were fed. In our own lives, we can often find ourselves in similar positions. It often feels easier to return to our previous imprisonment because at least that was familiar, reliable, even to some extent comfortable. The wilderness is uncertain and therefore scary. Not just scary, terrifying. And yet God calls us to it because God is not satisfied with our imprisonment. God did not desire for me to suppress who I really was or my call to ministry. God called me, and God calls all of us to live expansive and abundant lives. The Hebrew people did not know the abundance and plenty that awaited them on the other side of the wilderness. In the same way, we do not know the abundance and a plenty that awaits us. We pass on the stories of our spiritual ancestors to remind ourselves that our kindred have been here before, and that we can expect that God will care for us the same way they did in the past. Despite the upheaval in my Christian faith, there were two convictions that remained constant. One, the inherent dignity and worth of all creation. And two, the truth of the resurrection. I'll clarify that for me, I'm not necessarily tied to the idea that the human person of Jesus was zombie raised from the dead. What I am tied to is that death does not have the last word. Despite the suffering and transience of this world, there is always an opportunity for new life and new beginnings. I'll conclude by saying, in our reading today from 1 Corinthians, it reads, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." Pretty intense words. But I chose to reflect on them because it has a dual resonance for me. For one, it does feel resonant with our present moment. Perhaps I'm presuming too much to count myself among the wise and discerning, but I often feel like my own sense of wisdom and discernment is being thwarted at every turn. We also live in a world that does not seem to value what our community would count as wisdom and discernment. And yet, this reading, despite its initial pessimism, also offers us a profound hope that someday the wisdom of this world will be thwarted in favor of a greater wisdom, one that prioritizes the most marginalized and the liberation of all people. It seems foolish to believe in resurrection and new life when you're surrounded by death and destruction. And yet, the power of our faith is that the very thing that seems to be foolish, the very thing that seems to be a stumbling block, is our hope. That on the other side of the wilderness, there does await for us a life of plenty, abundance, and liberation. Thank you.